All right. Welcome, guys, to the Dark Council podcast, episode 3. Uh, Even though I know Academic Agent already kind of did this topic to death, but we're going to cover the Brazilian populist delusion that happened where all the Republicans and all in America and all like the right wingers thought that there was going to be like this mass groundswell of BS in Brazil that was going to somehow restore basedness to that country. Um, yeah, that's on the topic, and also we're going to go over general reactionary political strategies and how essentially our political strategies have typically been historically failures because we've always tried to conform to liberalism, and liberalism is intrinsically out anti-reactionary. So I have my two co-hosts on, Trad Raider.
Hola,
Introduce yourself. Yeah. And Bob is guest, or just Bob for this stream.
If you don't get the joke, that's okay.
Yeah, well, I don't expect the audience to get the joke. All right. So I was going to try to invite a Brazilian on, but he decided not to come on for reasons, mostly probably because their version of the FBI in Brazil, aka the federal police, probably doesn't want anybody like tacitly talking in support, I guess, of the right wing in Brazil, which is understandable. I mean, that happens in America, so we're all under the magnifying glass in this Kali Yuga.
Momento de los federales. Federal moment.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So yeah, let's get into this. So apparently, the protests, the stormings, yada yada, like January 6th, but Brazil, and like actually like 10 times bigger than, or like 100 times bigger than probably America's boomer storming of the Capitol. Instead, we had the boomer storming of the Brazilian Capitol.
The boomer
past few
revolution
days
is spreading.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, the boomers and the Gen Z and their final gasps of life are taking it out in very pathetic revolutions.
Gotta love it, dude.
Yes, I'm kind of unprepared right now, I admit. I don't really have articles. Prepared. Yeah, none of us are really prepared. This was like a last minute thing that we decided to bring up. But what's a good segue into actually like talking about this topic? Besides, it's just a
how much we hate Lula.
Yeah, I mean Lula, like he's pretty much the El Presidente Biden, just in Brazil. Just a senile old man that the left and the regime are toting around as their formalistic use of power.
Which is just, yeah, he's not exactly the smartest socialist to assume that there are any.
Well, I mean, I will like say Lenin was actually like pretty smart in understanding how power politics, and he wasn't into the populist delusion. He was very much into elite politics for bad intentions, but he still knew his shit.
Yeah, you may not respect his ends, but you appreciate how he executed the methods.
Yeah, it's
really
like
the bourgeoisie.
I mean, honestly, like the bourgeoisie are also the enemy of reactionary forces. So,
to an extent.
I mean, if you ask like most of the white army during the Russian Civil War, most of them were actually as equally anti-bourgeois as they were anti-Bolshevik. Mostly because the bourgeoisie did support like liberal actions in Russia that led to the what was it, the February Revolution, that put in like that liberal soft socialist Kerensky, and got rid of the monarchy that way. So like that was mostly a bourgeois revolution, and then the Bolshevik Revolution was like the working class revolution under Lenin, just a few months later in October. But that's like more for the talking about reactionary politics, like in political strategies portion of this podcast. But Brazil, I mean, do we have comments?
From the outsider's perspective, all I can say is it's kind of weird how the last few months of American politics, or last couple of years of American politics in the broad strokes, are kind of playing out in Brazil. Like, they're just shameless copyright infringers with the whole election that the right claims was stolen, and then what would this be? It was even in January too. Like, what was it? Their January 7th or 8th. It was their January 8th. It's the cheap off-brand version.
It's I think it encapsulates a big issue with not just, socialists being socialists, but also with the modern right wing, quote unquote, and that is that we can't have any genuine conservatives. It's all right-wing populists. Look at Hungary with Orban. Look at Turkey with Erdogan. Look at, the U.S. with Trump, or Britain with, what's his face? I forget his name. Boris Johnson. Yeah, Boris Johnson. And now Brazil with their Bolsonaro. Like, it just shows all of these, populist, in my opinion, scum, who just feed off of the right-wing conservative movement in general to push their own agenda, and it's really tanking actual conservatism, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yes. I would also have to say, commenting on that, also when we get like the quote-unquote right-wing, the quote-unquote based person into office, which I don't believe in democracy, period. Like, democracy is a lie. It's never. I believe the United States government and all of its sayings about election integrity. Yes, they're all free and fair, yada yada, the whole spiel. To get Susan off my back. But there is no democratic way to have a reactionary or like truly based movement, because guess what happens to all those people? Like, it goes against the grain of what the system is meant to fight, which liberalism is fundamentally meant to fight. Reactionary and right wing, like any sort of traditionalist movements, because you can just bribe the voter base, and you can do let's just say fortifications of elections.
To think about it in another way, it shows especially what is the, in my opinion, issue with like what you said with democracy, is that the acceptance of the liberal idea of a democracy where people from all beliefs can, show their beliefs and get elected and yada yada. It shows the fallacy of that, because the whole idea of liberalism is saying that maybe we're not right, maybe the leftists have points, and then allowing them to come into power. And it's exactly what conservatives have been doing for years, which is just giving ground to the left.
Well,
and
okay. Well, I was gonna say, you have to appreciate how masterful they are in it, because they're like, because we all know the Twitter stories right now that they're censoring information about the election. So the Republican Party's knee-jerk reaction must be, well, obviously we must make sure that these elections are as free and fair as possible, and all the information will flow. It's like, dudes, you're not dealing with ideas of equal weight here. You're dealing with dumb ideas from you guys, and then evil ideas from these people. You don't let evil ideas have an equal chance of winning. You don't give that. You don't make a fair playing field.
It's the exact reason why reactionary politics will never be allowed in a liberal democratic system, is because if you accept the ideal that your ideology is not inherently correct, right? If you don't accept that, your religion, that your politics, that your belief in monarchism and reactionaryism aren't inherently correct, that is the exact thing that we believe, is that we are correct. Hence why we're reactionary, hence why we're anti-democracy. So that's why we can never survive in a democratic system, and why it plays out like with now the conservatives being the party of, 5 years ago. Like, we want to conserve 5 years ago.
We stand up for
we want.
traditional gay marriage,
Mhm.
as the Supreme Court
I mean,
always intended.
What happened to the
yeah.
good old drag queen story hour?
So I mean, like this to bring it back to Brazil. I mean, Brazil was also they like Bolsonaro was one of these figures. Like he actually did try to say, "Oh, I'm a constitutionalist," but the Constitution of Brazil was made by Lula and his cronies. Like it literally is like it's not like the American Constitution that is like worshipped and is like this uh divine sacred document in the religion of democracy. It's like the literally the Brazilian Constitution is a few decades old at most. I think it's only a couple decades old.
4, because it was
Um,
in the 80s, I believe.
yeah, so it's like, and it was made by like Lula's party. So, and if you're Bolsonaro and you're supposed to be the right wing, you're supposed to be the based camp that's going to steer things back in a more traditionalist wing. First thing you would do is scrap that. Like you would completely rewrite the constitution and favor the country's political process towards your own faction. You would appoint people into institutions that would enact your own policies, um, that would enact your own will upon the country. Like it's the elite theory of history. You don't just appeal to the populace. You get power, you secure power, you fortify power, and you make sure your opponents cannot deal a blow against you.
No true Machiavellian like Lula would ever let the opposition truly have the chance to dethrone him.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
I did. So a couple of years ago, maybe someone gave me like the English translation of the Brazilian Constitution as a PDF, and the thing is so long. And I think looking back in hindsight, as I try to think of something additive to say to the sentence, I think something like I think it was over like 100 pages. As a comparison to the U.S. Constitution, which if you put it in 12-point font would be 3 pages at most. Um, I think that you have all these options for saying, okay, and subtle ways of ensuring that the people who wrote it would stay in power. Now, I haven't read it, so I don't know if that's there or not, but
I mean, even with the U.S. Constitution, that was still a thing.
yeah.
Like, do you know who, like, for what 8? No, it would have been not 8. It would have been like 12 years. For 12 years max, I think it was the Federalists had power in the U.S. And then for basically until Jackson, which was a lot longer, it was just Democratic Republicans, which is like, look who wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It was Democratic Republican, Democratic Republican, Democratic Republican. That's what the plan is. You write a Constitution or whatever founding document in your favor so that you will continue to keep winning and being in power. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And this appeal to constitutions, because I don't and looking at this from the religious perspective, the Constitution is just a product of men and people trying, and like religious, like the evangelicals and whoever, and right-wing America that still tries to advocate for Christian values or whatever, will make this appeal to something that was made by men as opposed to trying to appeal to God directly. It's like, why are you intentionally appealing to something that is inherently powerless? It only has power because we let it have power, as opposed to God, who is supreme and we can't do anything about it. Even I mean,
That's
God's
yeah.
always going
I
to be in
mean,
charge because He is.
I mean, not that it was only created by man, but it was created under liberal ideals, specifically like deistic, um, especially anti-Christian. Like people try to say, "Oh, the founding fathers were Christian." It's like, yeah, but they were like Calvinists and deists and Masons. They weren't like the trad cats. If they were trad cats, they would have probably just like restored the Jacobite claimant.
The shoot, what was it? I think it was Jefferson who wrote a version of the Bible that just was just the moral teaching and cut out all of the miracles.
Yep, it was
Mhm.
the Jefferson Bible, and they still sell it. And
Mhm.
I think what you were saying, Charles, absolutely is true, and it goes back to the point of, accepting that people who are wrong might be right. With accepting atheists, accepting like, oh, but what about the atheists' argument that you always hear? It's literally, yeah, they're wrong. I don't have to say that they're not. They're wrong. I think the government should be run the right way.
Yeah. I mean,
It,
intellectual arguments and whatnot, yeah, sure, whatever, have the intellectual arguments, but at the end of the day, the government needs to be consistent and the government needs to be as aligned to the truth as possible, so the government shouldn't entertain error or
yeah,
stupidity in general.
I like what alt monarchist said. He says they put the Constitution on the same pedestal as the Bible. And I think that is
Oh,
completely accurate in the United States. In the United States, we know more about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence than we do the Bible.
mhm. Also, shout out to Old Monarchist. He was my first co-host on the Dark Council. Yeah, we had a really good. That was at the beginning of the Russo-Ukraine war too, because I'm on the side of Russia, and he of course is on the side of Russia. So
I think I am
uh,
as well.
yeah, I mean, I pray for an end to the fighting, but I don't want Antichrist, aka the Ukrainian government, which I don't say the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian regime, are Antichrist.
Yeah,
Um,
the Ukrainian people truly are in a horrible situation, especially with, like you said, the Antichrist Zelensky, who just open out banned Russian Orthodoxy in Ukraine. Didn't
mhm.
even put a
That
spin on it. Yeah, he just banned it.
like today or
Yep.
like
No, this was a while
No,
ago.
oh.
yeah, it was like months ago or something. I
Oh,
or it was like a month ago or something. Oh yeah, it was the beginning of December. He did
oh,
that.
so like you had to be Ukrainian Orthodox. You can't like
Oh
support.
no, they banned Ukrainian Orthodox too.
Well,
Well,
the Ukrainians that were Orthodox that were aligned with Moscow and not the Kievan.
yeah, the Canadian page because I don't. Well, see, here's the thing with Orthodox ecclesiology that I don't get. It's like you do realize that there's like a supreme authority you could appeal to for these issues, right? Like
There's a
he's
certain
over
there's a
there.
certain fella who goes by the name Pontifex Maximus who might be able to help you with that.
I don't know, but it's just I don't like Christians killing each other.
I don't either.
Um, I don't know.
I think that's an agreed upon point, is that
Yeah.
Christians killing each other is poor power play, and it's just a horrible thing in general.
And
Mhm.
but I will say this: I don't care if Russia wins. I just want to see the State Department lose. I mean, and I don't say that, and I mean, I say that in a joking way, but I mean, at the same time, though, like I just like what I don't want. Like if I could, stop and ensure that no more civilians would get killed, yeah, I would. But at the same time, like what kind of civilian life are these people going to live after the fact? And both sides, wherever the border ultimately ends up, um, because I mean, if they're at the West, I mean, yeah, Ukraine wins its independence or whatever and preserves its independence or whatnot, but at the same time, it's just going to be filled with the same moral,
it
stuff.
it
It's going to die the same death that we're dying. And
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's going to be fully absorbed into the GIE, and it's going to be corrupted by the toxic influence of the State Department. I mean, like, oh, and also, alt monarchist did say it was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy. So it was that specific um, branch of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine that was targeted. I did see them actually like burning sacred iconography of the Theokwe and Christ. So it's like, huh. Well, which regime is Antichrist again?
yeah, well, you don't. I don't. I mean, like, I understand that Zelensky would want to enforce like a Ukrainian identity separate from that of Moscow, but at the same time, it's like, I mean, there it is again. It's people putting religion below politics, and it's that
Mhm.
sort of attitude that just needs to die.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what liberalism does at the end of the day. Liberalism proclaims itself infallible, and everything else is fallible. Um, so that I mean that's one of the many heresies of liberalism that especially Was it Pope Leo the ninth? I think it
No,
was
it
wrote
was
against
Pius
it.
the Ninth who had the syllabus of errors.
Oh, Pius the ninth. Yes, I knew it was a ninth.
Yeah. Leo the Ninth was maybe Middle Ages. I don't know when
He
Leo
would have
the Ninth
been.
was.
He would have been before the 14. He would have been in or before the 1400s, and I say that because Pope Leo X was the one who declared Martin Luther a heretic and had all his stuff burned.
So Pope Leo's
yeah.
being based is a very
the official. Oh, definitely. The official wording was, by order of His Holiness Pope Leo X, the works of Martin Luther are to be erased from the memory of man.
Mm-hmm.
That's just.
Well,
I know what I'm going to be doing next Reformation Sunday.
Wunderbar. But I mean, this is going to soon turn into the Brazil, Ukrainian, and General Reactionary podcast. But I mean, like, I don't know. Like, this is quickly developing into tangents, but honestly, like, tangents is kind of what the right is these days because we don't have power. Like, the thing is, like, the right has not known how to wield power effectively. And in a way that can secure its existence into the future. And that's kind of honestly like I say this like both like especially World War One was the death of the true right. Like it killed the idea of having a truly like reactionary regime in the modern age. Because like World War One was still the modern age. And we had all these great empires that were actually still thriving. But then through the forces of London and New York, essentially, it sought to destroy all those forces. Like, few people like remember this, but many Wall Street financiers financed Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Like liberalism funded Bolshevism in Russia to destroy the Tsardom. World War One, London, Washington, and Paris refused to negotiate with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Like they would only negotiate with like the Reichstag, essentially.
I think that is. I think I'd slightly disagree with that. I think that World War One was the final hurrah, I guess. Yeah, because after there were still regimes. There were still based regimes, of course, but sorry, just got a message. Okay, sorry, but there were obviously very reactionary, very like to say based regimes afterward, especially Franco. But I think it was the last birth of any because Franco started in the 20s, and there was no after the 1920s there were no more risings of truly reactionary, truly traditional, really anything. So I think it was the last birth of any, being that of Franco. But after that, there was none.
Well, I kind of say it was like the last gasp, but look at Spain today. I mean, after Franco was out of the picture, I mean, were the Carlists and the Phalangists able to maintain their place? No, they didn't because Franco still traded with the West. He still he still allowed people to go between like in the press, foreign presses from like New York and all these places. He allowed them to come into his country. He allowed them to subvert it. He didn't understand that these forces could be used against him. He didn't understand the soft power, and that was like one of the failings of Franco. That was more like late Franco though. Like early Franco, he did understand those forces a lot better, and there was a lot simpler time before the State Department actually got wise to subverting reactionary regimes even more.
Unfortunately, I do think that Spain would have prospered had Juan Carlos not reversed Franco's policy.
Yeah,
that too.
I think it was like after Franco, the suicide rate just it was either the suicide rate or the no, I think it was the budget in comparison to the suicide rate. Like the budget went up and up and up, but the suicide rate also went up and up and up, or
Mhm.
something. I don't know. It
But he
was
brought stability to post-Republican Spain, and that's exactly what it needed.
yeah, which especially considering Spain had been a wreck for.
I mean, he also gave Spain, like, he gave the Spanish people purpose. Like, he made them believe in themselves again. And what does liberalism do? It destroys the soul. Like, it came from a Croatian communist. I'm forgetting his name for the life of me. But he said after escaping communist Yugoslavia, he said that communism breaks the body, but liberalism rots the soul. And that's like the tactic of liberalism. It will rot everything from within. It will destroy everything through entropy. It won't like do a blazing glory like communists will try to do. They'll just slowly chip away, decay the true good and the beautiful down to its base form, down to its mush. That is the liberal world.
Well, there was the artist, Canadian songwriter Stan Rogers, and he did a lot of sea shanties and wrote some of his own songs like Northwest Passage or whatnot. And I'm not sure about what was his political ideology. He died young. He died in a plane crash, unfortunately. I think it was a plane crash. But anyways, he wrote this song about this guy and all these factories in the East are closing, and he goes out west not because he doesn't like cowboy clothes, but he says, but the government dough will rot your soul. That sort of government sponsored lying around, having no purpose in life, as opposed
Oh,
to
yeah.
then he says, but work I must, so I eat this dust and breathe refinery.
Absolutely. I'm just it's truly, I think, the best term for what liberalism, and to kind of encapsulate everything that Darth said about it, is that while communism is abject horror, liberalism is the mundane horror, because it's not openly horrifying. It slowly, like he said, rots your insides and just destroys the soul.
And I think this was back even before because I was always more socially conservative. I've got more socially conservative because I was like, well, because at one point, unfortunately, I was in the well, I don't like gay marriage, but it's not my place to say anything camp. Before I recognized separation of church and state was big dumb, but but
You're getting roasted in chat here, but anyways, in the middle of a rant.
okay, but anyways, I'm not looking at the chat. But anyways, what was I gonna say? Shoot! But the first thought I realized, that was somewhat based is, I guess, in hindsight, was the reason why, like the sort of system we're in now, and I don't think I would have called it liberalism at the time, is more effective at destroying things, is because it's slower than communism, which is more, brute force and open about its goals. Um, and whereas we're just slowly cranking up, like the frog, although apparently the frog was in actuality the guy who did the boiling frog experiment. He lobotomized it first.
That's what
Um,
happens when we're educated into believing the lies of liberalism. We're lobotomized into believing it's okay.
there we go.
Well,
The metaphor still works.
I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, we're literally taught this from like grade school. We're taught to like love and admire the system. Like the system can do no wrong. There was nothing before the Constitution or like before America, and there will be nothing after. Everything before was evil. Like that. This is a trope of liberalism that, like Robespierre and Locke included a lot in their writings. Um, was essentially that we we can only obtain things through the rational mind. There's no such thing as a higher purpose. Anybody who asserts to have a claim to authority is wrong, essentially, and yada yada. And then Robespierre would also go on to say that, oh, this society has corrupted man, and the true noble is just the savage in the woods, and that he is the truest expression of humanity, and everything else is a perversion. And It's like, do you want to see what the noble savage looks like? There's a few islands in the middle of nowhere.
You really ought to
um,
give Iowa a try.
it's like, everywhere. Like, honestly, this might sound chauvinistic, but anywhere that hasn't really been touched by, like, Christianity is a sign of incline in civilization, and the people that say it was like the beginning of the rot are just retarded. But I will say, like, the Chinese civilization, despite them not having Christianity for their development, they also were able to create a civilization, but also was based around a higher purpose of the mandate of heaven, that there was a divine purpose to life and civilization, not just hedonism and depravity like we have
And
today.
they understood Christian concepts, because God, as Saint Thomas Aquinas put so elegantly, all truth is God's truth, even if it is pagan. And the Chinese did find God's truth, that being the mandate of heaven or divine right. And for they called it ancestor worship, but what they were doing was basically like what we do with saints, which they they had the idea, just not quite yet.
I mean, it was like, this is what, I mean, Hindus had this idea of, like, generally, like, the different religions across the world, that because many of these religions do have an aspect of the truth, and they said it was like touching an elephant, but like each religion like touches it in a different place, but everybody knows it's an elephant.
Yeah.
It's like they're not going to have it's specifically they're blind and they're touching the elephant. Like, they know it's an elephant, they just haven't discovered the full thing of it yet. Which, that's what I describe like most pagan religions as. Like, they do have kernels of the truth, and other non-Christian religions, they have the kernel of the truth, but they don't have the full truth in Christ.
Yeah, and the term, I guess, from a historical standpoint, I think what happened is, of course, you have Adam and Eve, and then the line goes, was it Seth who would eventually, but anyways, and it's that line. But as it splits off, you have these different groups of people who are separated from, who would eventually become the ancient people of Israel. But they still retained elements of the truth. It's just over the years it got perverted in some way. So they would have had pieces of the original revelation, and you can kind of piece that together today. But it was only, it was only ancient Israel that preserved the revelation until the coming of Christ. But all the ancient religions, whatever they had, would presumably have come from what they inherited from their parents, who eventually, at some point, would have been, you could link back to at least well, I say at least Adam and Eve, but that's pretty much the start of humanity. So that's not a very
I mean,
complete.
that's just called perennialism, by the way. The idea that all religions, all philosophies stem from one perennial source. I mean, that's why like many civilizations have like the same myths. It's like like in the Vedic civilization, they call Adam and Eve something else, but it's literally like almost word for word the same. Except for like Satan isn't just like a demon; he's actually like the god of the god of destruction and stuff, called Kali. And that's why like the Indians call this era the Kali Yuga, or the age of Kali, and that's why everything goes to shit essentially. Is their explanation. um, other peoples typically call it the Dark Ages, although typically like India actually has like the longest Dark Age. Like, Adam and Eve was the beginning of the Dark Age according to the Vedic civilization, and we still have like 100,000 years left of this Dark Age. It's like, wow, great, if the Vedics are right.
Yeah, well,
I'm just speaking like proverbially. Like, I'm not.
yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it would be, because we don't know when the end of time is coming, and everyone's like, oh, the and quoting all these different things that saints have said over the years. And yeah, it sounds like that. It sounds like, all the evil stuff that the saints were talking about, but you got to remember, it could always be worse.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and of course we were told that we will not expect when it happens.
Yeah.
We'll never
Yeah.
truly know when the end of times is.
Yeah.
So I bring up this point when people talk like, oh, everybody thinks that the end times is in their lives because they want their lives to be special. But I bring this point up. There has been about double the amount of generations between the time of Abraham and Christ than the time between Christ and us.
Yeah.
So thinking about that like in perspective, we could be going through this for millennia longer. And because of that, you kind of have to take like the long view. You can't just try to make everything perfect at here. Instead, you just lay the bricks for a future foundation that you won't see. It's like those builders that built like these cathedrals that took like hundreds of years to build, knowing that they will never step foot in it, but that their grandchildren or their great grandchildren will adore Christ in these beautiful testaments to human achievement.
Yeah. And always on your personal level, always be prepared for it to happen now. Make frequent use of the sacraments, especially confession and the Eucharist. But don't let that be an excuse for slacking off or whatever at your task and whatnot. Like even I think it was St. Paul writing. I can't remember who he was writing to, but essentially everyone in one of the Greek cities had just like stopped farming or whatever because they thought Christ would be coming back like any minute now. And he's like, "No, guys, stop! Like, do your jobs."
I mean, it's also the idea that you don't put off, like say going to confession, especially like the exorcist priests will talk about this the most. And if you're in the Catholic Church, I think also the Orthodox talk about this too. Generally apostolic. If you're in apostolic succession, this is a general how to, but never put off going to confession. Never put off doing the never do what am I trying to say?
Never
Keep your
delay
soul.
the sacrament.
Yeah, never delay the sacraments. And they really emphasize that because for one, it's like, maybe the end times aren't around the corner. You're not going to experience it in your own lifetime. But you don't know when God decides your final breath. And you don't know if you're going to be hit by a car and that will be your end. You don't know if you're going to, I don't know, be conscripted to a war and then blown up. You never know. These things are out of our control. Our deaths are frankly out of our control.
Yeah.
And
so we must prepare for them accordingly.
And
Mhm.
and remember too that we like to think we have excuses for not doing it because like, oh, I live like an hour away from the for us living in the 21st century, like, maybe the persecution will get like really bad in a couple decades and everyone will, look at me and be like but right now, we it's never been. I mean, it's really easy to get to confession, to get to Sunday mass and whatnot. Like I drive past two churches to go to the mass I go to. Normally we used to normally go to on Sundays. Now we go to the local one, but that was the parish that my mother went to, so we went there. Like I drive, like you, like we were driving past two Catholic churches to get to a Catholic church. Um, it's never for us in America right now. We really don't have an excuse. Now, obviously, sometimes people will have an excuse, valid excuses, like my legs, are broken and my cell phone just died and stuff. But really though, it's never been easier. It's not like the Catholics in England who had to have a priest say mass, and as soon as the priest was done with mass, he had to book it because um somebody probably said something. Yeah.
That being said, I think we have veered wildly off topic, and we
Yes,
should return.
to bring this back, I was actually thinking about this. It's kind of like, don't delay the sacraments, but also it's like to bring this back to reactionary politics period too. It's don't delay laying the foundation for honestly like trying to make a reactionary revival, no matter how small of an effort. Like I'm not saying like go out to the streets with like try to do the populist delusion and think you can just convince people. It's more like building institutions that will live beyond your life, or pieces of art that express something of your culture, express something true, good, and beautiful, and not conforming to the hedonistic modernity of liberalism. Um, Supporting your local parish. I mean, even becoming a priest. Like honestly, you want to talk about like one of the most base things you could do if you're called to the priesthood. That's honestly that's one of the most reactionary things you can do in the modern age. And be the vessel for the sacraments to be distributed to the mass. Well, not the masses, but those who come to it, those who come willingly. Um, and it's like do these little things that you think could possibly lead to a brighter future, more in line with God's beatific vision, to try to emulate God's beauty on earth. Like, you're never going to have perfection. You're never going to have your perfect society. You're never going, like, that's what liberalism's objective is to create the perfect society, but their vision of perfection is warped and twisted. Our goal is to understand that we can only emulate and we can never achieve perfection.
To quote the great conservative CGP Grey, striving for perfection, we will always come up short, but perhaps we will get a little closer in the process. Of course, when you realize, it sounds like a great quote, but when you realize he's talking about airplane boarding methods,
I mean, what was I going to say on top of that? I mean, I'm writing a book series that, I mean, I don't even try to make it like like a reactionary utopia. Instead, I more make it like what probably a reactionary world would look like in a very honest form, and how you could have a reactionary world in the modern age. It's not just this fantasy from the Middle Ages. I mean, a lot of reactionaries too, honestly, are stuck in the past. Like, yes, the past was beautiful. I love the Middle Ages. I love the Renaissance, but we're never going to be able to reverse the clock. Like, we have to live in our age. And
it's
I mean,
important that we adjust to the modern age, but not in an accepting way. We adjust our strategy to continue the cause of reactionaryism and fit it to a modern day so that we may continue to push forward and strive for the best.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I mean, you want to talk about like a great piece of reactionary fiction written in modernity. Like that's one. And it even, I mean, unfortunately, liberals like read it and they just see fantasy, and they don't actually like understand the deeper messages, which is sad.
Yeah, I mean I don't know how they could read. What was it? Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring, renewed shall be the blade that was broken, and the crownless again shall be king. I mean, I don't know how you can read that and be like, oh, he's just like me. The people who say Tolkien was a neo-pagan, I don't want to slap you. But at the same time, I want to metaphorically slap.
I mean, it's
sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to say, it's kind of funny what progressives when they create like a fantasy world, or like I'll kind of say like Wakanda, for instance. It's like, well, what is Wakanda? It's an absolute technically elective monarchy, but it's mostly hereditary. Ruled, and it's an ethno state. It honestly is like it's honestly an ethno state that
It
has
views
close
everyone else as
borders.
superior.
Yep. But the reason why they like it is because it's African and not European. Like that's literally the only difference.
Indeed. And sorry, I was looking for a quote here. So calling back to when you were saying, do anything that can, even if a little bit, push us in a more reactionary, more Christ-like direction. To quote the great philosopher known as myself on Twitter, when an institution of man is driven to Luciferianism, it is not only preferable but necessary that every Catholic should endeavor to destroy it as an act of the Lord our God.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, also like our enemies use subversion against us. Honestly, like we can't, just because they use a tactic doesn't mean that we can't use a tactic. Subversion is a legitimate strategy to take down your enemy when you don't have like essentially the force to take them down conventionally. And that's how they whittled down like our what used to be like the true good and the beautiful in Christendom, and limited down to like honestly like I make a distinction between between the terms Western and Christendom. I never intermix them because Western was distinctly like liberal in its origin. It was post Enlightenment, after like the true age of Christendom had ended. Which I mean, you could argue that was the Protestant Reformation, or you could argue that it was the Enlightenment. I float between the two. I say
We
it's
just
kind of,
blame both.
yeah. I blame both. um, I mean, the Protestant revolt was kind of like it was the foundation
Of the
for the
Enlightenment.
modern world.
I think
Yeah.
it definitely, because it started the spread of the idea that you can challenge the hierarchy in the system, and it's what led to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and all of the horrible disasters that became Europe and the rest of the world since.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know, the playbook they've written, because we did, conservative Europe, I guess traditional Europe did put down the French Revolution, but they thought that, okay, we got a Bourbon back in charge, everything's going to be a-okay, and they took the opportunity and they just slowly uprooted everything, uh, pretty violently in France again, but then throughout Europe, and we need to take that playbook. But also, I would say that one of the things we can do on an individual level, and we should all strive to do, is, as one of the dismissals for the mass goes, go and glorify the Lord by our lives. And I think that politically, of course, we have to be these sneaky people who subvert the institutions and try to gain a foothold and whatnot. But when it comes to our personal lives, one of the because ultimately the salvation of souls is our primary goal, which is why we want the state to be a certain way, because it's most conducive to the salvation of souls. Which is my answer of why should we bother to care about politics at all. Um, we need to be good Catholics, and I think that sometimes we get caught up so much in the um, I don't know. We get caught up in all these things that are important to talk about, but at the same time, how many of like can either of you list for me the seven gifts of the
We've
Holy Spirit and the 12 fruits of the Holy Spirit? Because I need to memorize those. I know the 6 precepts of the church. I know the 10 commandments, but I need to get more of those basic fundamental things.
I think I have a way to word what you were saying earlier. We are so blinded by the fog of worldly things that we forget the spiritual.
Yeah, there you go. My stunt double on can
I need to
pitch
just
in things.
I just need to like say quotes and then attribute them to you.
I mean, I'm sure audio people 100 years from now. Wouldn't that be great if like 500 years from now, the great climactic war is over, and the conservatives are still in charge, and all that remains of YouTube is a few scattered audio logs of my ravings, and then Tradrator, but the audio has become so muddled that the future generations won't be able to distinguish us, and they
I
think
could
that
compress
it's
it to
just me.
32 bits and it would sound like we're the same.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna make because Academic Agent talks about this. He talks about the fact that like maybe like 100 years from now or like a few hundred years from now, when the decadent age, like theoretically our age is over, like our dark age, um, is over. Like people are going to record like the major influencers on the distant right today as like wizards or like the great scholars. They're not going to be like, oh, they're not going to call them academic agent. They're going to say like the the wizard AA or something, like whatever name he ends up going by later. Like they're gonna view us kind of like Merlin, like it is in like the story of King Arthur, where it's been mythologized. Like Merlin probably could have been a real man,
Yeah.
but he had been mythologized into a wizard because of his role to King Arthur, when he was actually alive and when King Arthur was alive. So if I ever like rise to any prominence, I'll be like, like if I ever publish my books, it will be like I'll kind of be like Dostoevsky or something. Like I'm not going to say I'm going to be as great of a writer as Dostoevsky, but they're going to portray, because you only see like his images of him later in life. Where he's like a hunchbacked monk, kind of like disparaging the world, and kind of pessimistic about the world. That's probably going to be me.
I am fairly sure that all of us share the desire to be well depicted as what's the word I'm looking for here? As I can't think, basically just depicted as very regal and very steadfast, I think is the best term.
Well, for me, because here's the thing,
I'm,
I'm a
I
peasant.
mean, like the reason.
Oh, I was just gonna say I'm a peasant, and I know I'm a peasant, and if my name is lost to history, Bob is Guest, Charles York, or Warren, or whatever you want to call me. If all that's lost to history, that's fine. But as long as I inspire someone who will eventually go on to be one of those great people, that's fine by me. Because honestly, I care about the I don't. I mean, if people remember me, that's great. I hope they just. But I don't really care for me personally. I don't. I just.
So yeah, the reason why like I mentioned like we'll probably be like depicted as like either like wizards or just like these weird ethereal creatures is because honestly like look at the sacred iconography from the time of the fall, like, well, the falling of Rome to by the time Charlemagne came around, like that several centuries gap. I think it was like 6 centuries. Like it was a long period. What are most of the saints depicted as? Most of the time they're very uh, malnourished. Most of the time they're very depicted humbly. They're depicted as hermits. These very holy men, um, like they have a toll in life, and that toll is taken a lot upon their bodies. You can see it wearing on them. And honestly, I believe that currently we are in a dark age. And if our images are preserved into the future, we're probably going to be depicted like those early saints of the church, very humble, very, uh, just very uh, taken a toll by the world because the world will constantly lash out at us.
Indeed, I think that if you think of the quote of hard men creating or weak men creating hard times creating strong men creating good times creating weak men. We are in the hard times created by the weak men before us, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, and I think
I
that we've come into a point where we need to bring up good times, and it's it's a good way to view our current situation.
So call me pessimistic, but I kind of agree with Oswald Spengler on this point of like we're probably like the Dark Age is going to last about 200 to 300 years, and like you can't stop the Dark Age and you can't like bring about the next age. Like the age needs to run its course, and I would say we entered the Dark Age probably probably at the First World War, and it just been a slow destruction of civilization. I mean, either we're in the fall or we're in the winter. I would bank on we're in the winter, but we could possibly still be in the fall of I'm talking about like in seasons. Like the spring is the rising of civilization, summer is the plateau, fall of course the decay, and winter is the death. I don't know if we've entered the death of civilization or if we're still in the decay. I guess that will just be for future historians, like centuries down, to kind of conclude. Well, we just have to ride the tiger.
We can. You know what? I think I've changed my mind. I think we can. We'll never truly know what we are, but with the ideal of the men of the past in our minds, I say we push forward and attempt to make the world better and to return the world to a godly, Christ-like state, or at least as close as we can. Because if we don't do it, if we don't do it for ourselves, we must do it for others.
I mean that's why I mentioned like the early saints, because what was their kind of mission? It was more of a surviving the Dark Age, keeping the church alive, preserving the knowledge of Rome, even within just even just within the monasteries, and then be the vanguard for the rebirth of civilization. Which that eventually came under the Emperor Charlemagne. God did deliver our Caesar, which I mean, I don't know if we're going to just have to hunker down at this point, be like be like after the fall of Rome, what the church did. We're just the preservers of civilization for future generations.
Unfortunately, it may be that way, but no matter what, we'll be able to. I trust in our ability to weather the storm and prevail against the gates of hell.
Yeah. And I think it was, who was it? Maybe it was Saint Augustine. He said, there are these men who say, about Christians that they will go and they will have their day. And he said, but day by day I see these men die themselves, while the church lives on and preaches the power of God to every succeeding generation. And you know what? And I think it was who Esther. It was the book of Esther, where her uncle Mordecai, I think it was her uncle Mordecai, said that God will deliver his people, if not by you, then by someone else. But Esther, rose to the call, and she interceded, and because of her, the Jews weren't destroyed by, was this Babylon or Persia? I can't remember. But
I think it was Babylon.
Yeah, so God is going to save his people, no matter what. But we should all respond to the call to help in that preservation in whatever personal capacity he calls us to do it. Some people are going to be theologians. Some people are going to be holy priests. Some people are going to be just the laity who are going to say, I know what's right and I don't care what you say. And so wherever we fall, we should pray to know where exactly we're going to fall in that and we should respond accordingly.
So I mean that gets into the doctrine of the caste. I mean, this is kind of what every civilization, even Christian civilization, has taught. It's like in Christian civilization they don't really say caste as much; they more say station in life, but it's just another word for caste. Like generally, there's always priests, warriors, merchants, and peasants. Those four castes are typically the building block. You may have like a fifth slave caste in some civilizations, but generally that's like an add-on, not necessarily a feature. But I mean, we have the priests are always on top. Like if you even look at like the French estate generals, who was the first estate? It wasn't the nobility; it was the clergy. The clergy were seen in as the first caste. They are the closest to God. They offer the sacraments. They offer the sacrifice. And then was the second estate? The second estate is the warrior caste, and they are the temporal rulers. They rule the world temporally. Well, then the priests rule it spiritually. Then you get the merchants, and they're closer down to the earth. They deal with it. They deal with commerce. They deal with the facilitating of culture down at the low levels. And then the peasantry, which is the majority of people, who essentially are the bedrock of the civilization, are the foundation. Because without any of the castes, the civilization destroys itself. Like we're currently living in an age where merchants have put themselves above both priests and warriors, and in this weird like inversion of the triangle. And essentially that's why like the merchants, the bourgeoisie, they always push for liberals, and they always push for abstracting of like, and the idea that there is no one truth, that there is no idea of one truth of God. They always subjectify it. That's also another thing that's we have to target in this age, and we have to kind of subvert that idea.
I think that with the castes, I think it's a great explanation for political ideas. Communism is the belief that the peasant caste is above the nobility and the clergy, and capitalism, the merchants above the clergy and the nobility, and then even oligarchy and tyranny being that of the nobles, believing they're above the clergy. But I think that's why religion, especially the Catholic Church, is one moment.
Well, any true civilization incorporates all four castes into its vital function. Like how much I despise the merchant caste. I know I could not have a civilization without them involved, or at least be very difficult.
Yeah.
But the two castes that are closest to God at the end of the day, like in terms of like I'm not saying like each cat like some castes are superior necessarily, but the priest and the warrior, they're the two higher castes. And that's because they deal with honestly the the destiny of the civilization. They preserve the health of it, and they guide it forward into the future, hopefully intact. I mean, you can't have corrupted clergy, you can't have corrupted warriors, but typically, the warrior caste is always the most stable rulers, and the priestly caste always supports the warrior caste in ruling temporally. And the warrior caste gains its legitimacy from the priestly caste. That's typically how almost all civilizations have been. And of course, today, if like, I wish I had Revolt Against the Modern World like right next to me by Julius Evel, because even though he was into weird, cringe neo-paganism and stuff, he did have this really good point. It's like the second to last chapter in the book on like nationalism, where he talks about like how essentially you can look at the history up till now as a degradation of the castes. Like World War One was the final death nail of the second estate, the warrior caste ruling in our time. And it was supplanted by the third estate, or the merchant caste, in the form of London and New York. And then in World War II, it was the supplanting of the third estate and this battle between the third and fourth estate, because like National Socialist Germany, even though they're like, some people try to claim them to be right wing, like they were the third position, they were kind of like both, but they were a peasantry ideology. It was fundamentally the fourth estate, but it was this battle between the third and fourth estate that was World War II and into the Cold War. And essentially, we've been living in the age where we've only had the ideas of the third and fourth estate politics, the peasantry and the merchants. Like that's what you can kind of see, like how elite institutions always target populist movements, is because fundamentally they don't want a fourth estate movement arising in liberal nations. Because if that happens, like that is a threat to the third estate and its power.
And
Because
that's another proof of the democracy, because it's used to give rise to the fourth estate.
Mm-hmm. And that's why oftentimes you'll see like the American Revolution, it was fundamentally a third estate revolution. And guess who they gave the power to? Oh, themselves after the revolution. It was the landowning elite of age 21 and up. They opened the franchise a little bit, but generally the actual voting population was very limited.
I mean, and I guess part of it is because I think there's a lot of people who are caught up in this populist movement and they don't really know this whole I guess first, second, third, fourth estate thing. And I'm pretty sure that I'm a peasant and I know I'm a peasant, and one of the things I like about monarchy is, ooh, there will be this guy who will be in charge and he's going to be able to do things, and I'm not going to have to worry about that, and I can just focus on what's going on in my life and my local community. That's great, which is why I think I'm a peasant and I know it. But we need to get these people who are caught up in these populist movements like, okay, yeah, but the fourth estate shouldn't be running the show. We should be supporting people who will be running the show, but not these third estate people, like these second and first estate people. Because I mean, I don't know.
Let the estates do as they're intended. Let the first estate preach, the second estate rule, the third estate do business, and the fourth estate do labor.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do my job, whatever that's ultimately going to end up being, and I don't want to have to deal with, because I mean, I used to be really into like politics and learning what China was doing and learning, but I come to this realization that I only care insofar as it's relevant to how society should function, and like I guess because like I say, like the reason, like my monarchism and my politics and everything that has to do with what I believe, what I credo, that all of that is subject to my Catholicism. So I really, honestly, I don't care if about your committee arguments on whether or not the internet should be regulated this way or that. I only care about internet regulation in regards to banning pornography. Burn it with the fire greater than that of 1,000 suns, please. But I can't bring myself to care about most of these different regulations like I used to, where it's like, oh, they're talking about regulating Amtrak or whatever. Well, or it's like I don't care.
Oh,
You're telling me there's a class whose job it is to figure that out? Yes, please.
I mean, it's fundamentally like that at this point. Like the third estate has ruled for so long that their system is bloated, and that's honestly why. And they create these institutions to give legitimacy to themselves. Like, oh, we created the mess, and now we're going to create the solution to our mess. We're not actually going to fix the mess. I mean, that is what the third estate always does when they rule for so long. I mean, that's actually what crippled Venice after a while, is they just had all these Byzantine laws are made under their mercantile republic for centuries. And I mean, it just became unsustainable, which honestly, I think that's what's happening with like the GAE. Like the GAE is built upon all these third estate principles that are
What's the
just
GIE again?
global American empire, the gay.
Oh, I thought you said
Yes.
GIE. Okay.
Yeah, the GA. But where was I going? I mean, honestly, like if you want the most deregulated, most deregulated societies on Earth, it was when you had the second estate in power. Because what is the economics of the second estate? The economics of the second estate is feudalism. Like you see this in ancient Japan, you see this in Europe, you even saw this in the late Roman Empire. Like it is when the second estate has the right to both rule the land, dictate the laws, and guess what? Warriors don't like complicated laws. They prefer honor codes. They prefer keeping one's word and generally stability. They're not going to they're not going to debate legislature in the House of Commons. They are going to go to war with their fellow nobles because they violated this precedent that is only known amongst warrior codes. you know,
That's
it,
why it's important to always keep yourself honorable as well. Never stoop to the level of the degenerates who would be dishonorable and just scoff at any form of traditionalism.
Yeah. I mean,
mm-hmm,
even in ancient Greece, and the ancient Greeks weren't exactly the most moral of people, but the whole Trojan War was started because everyone had agreed to protect the honor of Helen of Troy's marriage or whatever, and someone kidnaps Helen of Troy, and they're like, "Well, time to go to fight a decades-long war,"
mm-hmm.
because it's just what one does when one makes an oath.
Yeah, and I mean the warrior caste, because their place is also that their place. What am I trying to think? Well, they are for one ordained by God to rule, um, because of their birth and place in it. Like think about this. When people say, "Oh, well, hereditarianism is unjust," think about this. Okay, if you believe like in the Catholic conception of life and the dual nature of the soul and the body, why did God put your soul in this body, descendant of these parents? So for you, Charles or Bob, whichever one you want to go for this stream, you said you're born of the peasantry,
Yeah.
and you know your place. You were born there. God chose to put you in that caste for a reason.
Yeah.
And same with in you, Trad Raider. Like I don't know which caste you are of, but presumably God wanted you to be in that station.
I'd assume at least second and third somewhere. I'm guessing a mix because nothing can be preserved in modern society, unfortunately.
I mean, there has been the blending of the castes, especially when you're from America.
Unfortunately, but I can say with confidence that I know I am descended from certain members of the second estate. That is the lucky bit. So
Mhm. I at least know from my patriarchal line, I do descend from the second estate in Bavaria, but I don't know about the other lines. Most likely, the other ones were probably peasants. I will
Yeah.
say.
Well,
España por mí.
yeah. I mean, for me, it's more. I mean, as far back as I know, it's peasantry, but maybe there was one of my ancestors on my mother's side, or maybe it was like a great uncle or whatever, great great uncle. He was like half English and half Dutch. Oh no, he married into the Dutch part of the family, and he was a loyalist officer during the revolution, and he's buried in British Honduras. So maybe there's a little bit of the aristocracy in there somewhere. But either way, I just my entire I don't know. I mean, body
I
soul
think
composite. That's what we are. we are our bodies and we are our souls. And I was placed. I'm the son of a not wealthy man, and I am the son of a not wealthy mother. My grandfathers were both teachers. Um, my grandmother was making more than my fraternal grandmother was making more than my my fraternal grandfather when he retired, and he was the highest paid teacher at the school. But
So
you know,
It's important
I
to
kind of want to stop you there because you're talking about more about class and not caste.
oh,
Like they are distinct. Cat. So like class is it's typically a bourgeois creation. Like
okay,
when the bourgeoisie took over essentially the rulership in many nations, the idea of like caste systems they wanted to destroy. They wanted to grind with an axe because they hated the priestly and warrior caste so much. And instead they replaced it with this idea of wealth determining your status. And that's why we think of things like the working class, the middle class, the millionaires, billionaires, the wealthy, aka, and that's generally most people's perception of society. But like back in the Middle Ages, like most knights were pretty poor, but they were still the warrior caste. Like compared, a merchant had no authority even if he had a ton of money compared to a knight. A knight was the bestower of the law. He was the defender. He was the defender of Christendom. He had this great responsibility and levy placed upon him um, in several ancient traditions. While then a merchant is just a facilitator of trade. He has no authority.
indeed.
okay, well, I get
So
you.
good question, Bubba. Bubba asks, what's the difference between aristocracy and bourgeoisie?
Okay, so aristocracy is the warrior caste. Like aristocracy is just another term for the noble, the higher families of the warrior caste that actually rule. Um, so like this would be like your lords, your counts, your barons, your
Dukes.
non-royal dukes. Like
Yeah.
dukes could be royal or they could be aristocratic. It depended on the context. Um, but that is an aristocracy. They are the warrior caste and they rule. Knights were also considered very very low aristocracy in some cases, and sometimes they weren't considered aristocracy, but they still were of the warrior caste. Um,
It's it's important to remember as well, though, that the castes and your placement within it is not a reflection of you as a person. It is merely a reflection of where the Lord has decided you should be. And
mhm,
I don't think that, be they of the first estate or of the fourth, I don't think that we should. I don't think that we should treat anyone as less of a human being and a son of God.
mhm.
We were all
And
children.
just to
Go ahead, sir.
Oh, I was just going to say, just to answer what the bourgeoisie is. The bourgeoisie is another term for the merchant caste. Uh, it's, I mean, typically today it's referred to more like the wealthy members of the merchant caste or like the posh middle class. Um, but generally it just was meant to refer to the entire merchant caste.
Yeah, well, thanks for enlightening me on the whole caste versus class. Ooh, that'd be a good title of a video essay. Caste versus
Yeah,
Hmm.
Brazil, reactionary politics, and caste versus class.
yeah. Um, but no, I know. Okay, having so part of my job, as a museum, sometimes museums will host events, and I had to go in and turn some of the exhibits on, and as I'm walking out, I see this platter of these foods, and I look at it, and I ask the lady like, "What's that?" She gives me this complicated answer, and I'm like, "No thanks." This was just like these weird combo dishes or whatever. And I think, I look at the typical medieval perception of movies where you just have food, like of like banquet halls where you just had different kinds of foods put together. Like you had chicken and you had grapes and you had whatever. There weren't all these like weird I don't know. This is just getting into my own personal experiences that probably don't have any weight, but I don't get people. Who's
Ooh,
this?
that is a good question.
Also, yes. So Weston asked, since complementary lineages are so mixed, contemporary, would some people have to be recasted? So this gets into the cast of your soul idea of when the casts are blended so much. Especially this happens towards the fall of civilization, where the subversion of the caste happened. Like this actually happened in late Rome, where the patricians were pretty much stripped of much of their power, um, and they started blending with other castes in Rome. But essentially, they had to go through the civilizational collapse for essentially the lineages to find themselves again. Like during the Dark Ages, you saw the reemergence of these very distinct castes again because of the civilizational struggle of having to endure the winter season of civilization, having to endure that struggle and hardship. So there is the concept of the aristocracy of the soul, where you're born outside of the aristocracy, but you have an aristocratic soul.
I was going to comment on that because I think that it's important to remember that while you may be born of any caste or class, that does not determine necessarily, though it is a good factor of determining, it does not fully determine what caste you are in, because we've seen before multiple times that a man born of the peasant caste or even the merchant caste will rise to become a king, or even the most important example of that is a man who was born in the peasant caste to peasant parents and is now the King of Kings, our Lord Christ. So it's really about the soul, I believe.
Well,
you're more
I mean,
likely.
with Christ too, though, he was also a descendant of David. So
Yeah.
That's
at
true.
least from his. So I mean, he had that noble lineage. He had that noble
Of course.
lineage, that regal lineage as well,
But the point,
in his earthly form.
but the point stands of no matter, like, you can still be born into a caste and not be of that caste, including by lineage, even if you don't know it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why like a Pilate actually recognized Christ as a greater man. Like he did recognize him as like this true aristocrat, this truly great man, and why he honestly didn't want to kill Christ. Like, but it was kind of some people blame Pilate, especially Protestants. I tend to be he was backed into a really bad corner.
I agree.
And but I mean, what was I going to say? But yeah, you can be born outside of your caste. I mean, but then also you can degrade in caste too. Like, say you could be born into the warrior caste, but like the king that's like got the soul of a merchant. Like that does happen too. Like you can degrade in caste too. But it's very rare. Like 90% of people conform to their own caste. It's very the exemptions typically rise above their caste.
Yeah, I mean, I guess caste versus class. I think that still I'm fourth estate because in my ancestry, I never had any people who were in charge or even great business people. I mean, uncles or whoever may have been more third estate. Like there was one who became a cattle trader and was very good at that or something. So good, in fact, that he left his wife and married again and turned up years later. Isn't family history fun?
To an extent.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but sometimes you read you learn about family history stories, and you're like, oh, that's so tragic, even though you never knew any of the people, and you read it, and you're like, oh.
Indeed. I think we've come to a good end, but that's for you to decide, Darth. It is your podcast.
Yes. I mean, during the Kali Yuga, or the Dark Age, it is a difficult process, and honestly, I think that we are either entering it or we have entered it. And honestly, as reactionaries, I just think we're also gonna have to adopt like the Benedict option. I don't know if many of you have actually know what that is, but the Benedict option is essentially like what the Catholic Church did post the fall of Rome, the preservers of civilization, and just standing as that bedrock for once civilization could come back. And it's going to be a difficult journey to try to bring us back to civilization. We probably won't see it in our lifetimes. I highly doubt we'll actually see it in our lifetimes.
Unfortunately.
But
I was about to say, like, yeah, this is about it, unless you guys have final comments.
I say we end in prayer.
Yeah.
All right. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not
into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you guys for joining us for episode 3, Dark Council. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your night or whenever you're watching this. Thank you and good night. I really need to make an ending for this.
An outro.
Goodbye, fare thee well. Goodbye, fare thee well. Okay. There you go.
All right.
Cut it.
Cut it.